negative impacts that come along with it. I've always been really interested in the criminal justice system in the United States. So when choosing a topic, I wanted to do something related, but something that I didn't know a lot about. So throughout my presentation, my goal is to share with you all the knowledge that I have gained during the research process and hope to make you guys aware of the impacts that private prisons have on inmates, their families, and our society as a whole. To start off, a private prison is an institution that is owned by a private company. They make money based on each bed that is filled, and they're paid through contracts with the government, which generally require a minimum occupancy of around 90%. So this can cause a lot of corruptness and skew the incentive that these companies have. They're different from public prisons in a couple of ways. Public prisons are owned and operated by the government. They receive funding directly from tax dollars, which creates much more transparency with taxpayers, as they deserve to know where their money is being spent. I came across this during my research, as I found it was really difficult to find data that was released from private prisons because there's a lack of transparency because the money doesn't come directly from taxpayers. Most of the sources and the good sources that I found were from the early 2000s, which can create issues as I don't have the most relevant data for my project. Private prisons first became really popular in the 1980s with the rise of illegal drugs. There was an increase of 80% in the private prison population from 1999 to 2010. And as of 2022, 8% of all incarcerated individuals in the United States were held in private institutions. That being said, not all states even have private prisons. Only 27 states in the United States actually use them. And there's also a varying ratio of private prisons to public prisons in each of these states. For example, Montana sends about half of their incarcerated individuals to private industries, while in California, they only send about 0.5% of the incarcerated individuals to private institutions. This map clearly shows the difference in the private industries that are used throughout the United States. As you can see, the gray states have none, but other states like Montana, Arizona, Alaska, they have a much higher rate of incarcerated individuals in private prisons. The role of money is probably the most important difference in private prisons. This usually leads to conditions that are much worse for inmates. Money is generally prioritized over the well-being of the inmates and can compromise the safety and security, as money is not usually spent on adequately training officers. Overall, the corrupt incentive for money creates many problems and really does compromise and make a huge difference on the inmates' well-being. Some of the direct impacts on inmates is, first of all, they generally spend more time. For example, someone who is in a private institution generally spends on average 90 days longer in their not enough funding that is to adequately train correctional and violence, not just among aspects is that they really deny mental health care, and very little to no money is spent on the health care of inmates, which leads to higher rates of suicide as well. This image clearly represents the difference in wages for correctional officers. As you can see, private prisons, those who work in private prisons are paid much less than those. The most important part of a prison, in my opinion, is the rehabilitation process. In private or in publicly owned prisons, money is usually gone to education or rehabilitation programs that help prisoners become better people. Go to rehabilitation. Contracts usually do not include any programs and generally discourage rehabilitation within the industry. Programs, if they are relevant, are generally cut to maximize profit, which is another example of how money is prioritized over the well-being of these people. And recidivism rates are also much higher as a result, which means that someone who is released from prison is much more likely to commit a crime again and end up back where they were. One of the most important cases that I came across in my research is a case by the name of the Kids for Cash scandal, which happened in Pennsylvania in 2008. There were two judges, Mark Chiavarella and Michael Conahan, who were paid by a private company to send kids to jail. They were paid $2.8 million to send these kids to two newly built juvenile detention centers after knocking down the previously publicly owned state detention center. These kids were sent to jail for very minimal crimes. A girl by the name of Marshonda Stewart, who was 16, got into a fight at a park. She was then later sentenced after a 5-minute trial and was sent off in shackles and couldn't even say goodbye to her family. She, along with hundreds of other kids, experienced the same thing. Once the scheme was uncovered, Chiavarella and Conahan were both sentenced to jail. Conahan received they made on these kids' mental health and their families as well. There were many reports of suicide once these kids were released, and one of the kids even reported experiencing uncontrollable shaking throughout the day due to the trauma that he experienced. Today, privately owned institutions play a really large role. Immigration is a very relevant issue as of right now, and 90% of ICE detainees are held in profit-driven centers. In 2024, from the previous year, this just shows how much money the government spends on private institutions, even though we have public prisons that are options. And now many of you are probably wondering, why does this matter? Why should we care and without without the right programs and rehabilitation programs to make them better people, instead these conditions in private prisons can make them much worse. Rehabilitation generally just makes our society safer and more livable as a whole, and it makes all of us safer, and it impacts all of us too. Private sectors, their values are built off of money, and that most of the time comes at the expense of their inmates. But while public prisons, their values are built upon the well-being of society, which really impacts us all as a whole and benefits us all as well. All right, any questions? Yes.
I have two, but just for the sake of time, I'll let people ask, and then they're still none, I'll ask the other one. But the first one is, why do certain states have more private prisons? Why do certain states more rely on it, like Montana was your example?
Yeah, so I haven't really looked into that much, but I think it really depends on the governments in each state and just like their priorities. It also depends on like who's in power and where their priorities are set. Obviously, or I don't know if it's obvious, but there's many different circulating views about the private prison industry, and some people are very for it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought this was a great presentation. My question is more of a clarification, and I'm not sure if you've looked into this. It's okay if you haven't. But as I was watching this, I was thinking a little bit about the differences, especially in the 80s when incarceration rates went up so much. How, for example, crack cocaine had a much higher incarceration rate. It was much more pursued by police than just cocaine. Cocaine, of course, being used by predominantly white circles in higher economic places. Crack cocaine being associated with the inner city, specifically with African Americans. And I'm wondering if you looked into it all, the maybe differences of how these private prisons might maybe impact different racial identities differently. Do you find that that maybe, I don't know, I guess I'm wondering how we map this onto that story, and how maybe this shapes different incarceration rates differently for white people than for people of color.
So I haven't really looked into that specifically, but when I was looking into immigration and how there's a really large rate, 90% of immigrants are held in private institutions. So I think that plays a really big role and kind of shows the difference between how different groups are put into these institutions. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
That was a good question, Mr. Brooks, 'cause that was something I was wondering about as well, like how it sort of maps like 1980s to the emergence of like the war on drugs thing, because these two things are concurrent. But anyways, my question was also for clarification. You said that in private prisons, oftentimes people serve like on average, you said 90 more days than in public prisons. I was just curious, like, what is the reason for that?
There's a lot more leeway with private prisons, and because they're owned by a private company rather than the government, they get away with more things than the private or the public sector does. And same with like releasing data reports too. It's kind of similar. There's not an obligation to like follow all the rules and keep things just because they don't have to do that. They're privately owned. It's their own company. So I hope that answers your question.
Certainly. So like what it sounds like is just like oftentimes there's like lag time. Like they may have a certain release date, but like
yeah,
they aren't held to as strict boundaries as of like they should be released on.
Yeah, the standards are not released.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Who has oversight of the private prison in Idaho? Who is it? The governor? Is it the state legislature? Like who has oversight? If it's a federal prison, I know the federal government has oversight. But if it's a private prison in a state like Idaho, or I couldn't help but see the electoral map up there, who has oversight? Like who?
So it's these own companies. They will hire people. They create the contracts with the government. They pretty much oversee the workings. And then they don't really control who is sent to the prisons. That's more on the criminal justice department and the judges involved. But like I said, there's a lot of corruptness with the Kids for Cash scandal. They would pay judges to send like people to these places. So it's the companies that own the prisons that oversee the workings of it.
Thanks.
Did you come across any states that are creating rules that would prevent private prisons from being operated, or prevent private companies from operating prisons? Any states that have identified this problem and are coming up with solutions?
I don't think that I haven't read anything about that. I don't think there are any rules that specifically say that you cannot have a private prison. They're not too popular, as you probably saw in that map. But generally, there aren't really any rules regarding the restriction of private prisons.
I have one last question, if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay. And so why are states and / the U.S. government even having public prisons if it doesn't cut down on recidivism? It is they're paying out of their pocket for these private things to like run their own things instead of having it be a public prison. Why is the U.S. government having private prisons at all?
Well, for one, it helps the economy because they're able to rake in a lot of money. Like I mentioned earlier, they get paid for each cell that is filled. So to have that incentive and to have an opportunity where they can lock up these people and just automatically make money based on that is the #1 motive. So as I showed to you all today, there's so many problems with it, but there's also many problems in this world, and a lot of them come down to money a lot of the time. So that is pretty much the clearest answer that I can give you, is it really all comes down to money.
All right, we're going to get started with our second presentation. Ashley.
Hi, my name is Ashley Sarmanian, and my project is about the denial of the Armenian genocide. What got me inspired to pick this topic is that my great-grandparents were from Armenia and fled the Armenian genocide to come to America seeking refuge. I hope by the end of this presentation that you have a better understanding about what happened throughout the Armenian genocide and the lasting impacts of the denial by the Turkish government. Before I discuss the Armenian genocide, I would like to give background on how the Armenian people lived in Anatolia, now known as Eastern Turkey. The Ottoman Turks ruled and about 2.5 million Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire. The Armenian people practiced Christianity and the Turks believed in Islam. The Armenians were treated like second-class citizens. They were allowed to practice Christianity but weren't allowed full participation in government and were forced to pay higher taxes. The exclusion between the Turks and the Armenians lasted for hundreds of years. Meanwhile, the Armenians protested for equal rights. The Ottoman rulers resented Armenians that were better educated and wealthier than their Turkish neighbors. In 1908, Turkey had gotten a new government known as the Young Turks, and they created a more modern constitutional government. The Armenians were hoping for equality with the new leaders of the country. Meanwhile, the Young Turks just wanted to Turkify the empire. They didn't have intentions of giving Armenians equal rights. The Armenian genocide began on April 24, 1915. 200 prominent Armenian leaders were arrested, exiled, and executed. Throughout the spring and summer, the Armenian population were forced out of their homes. Vehicles, including tens of thousands of men, women, and children, were driven hundreds of miles toward the Syrian desert.
These deportations were disguised as resettlement programs. Many Armenians were forced to walk to their destinations, intending to be death marches. These marches exhausted the population due to harsh conditions without food or water. Children were often split from their parents and sold to Turkish families in attempts to convert them to the religion of Islam. Many Armenians died before reaching Syria, but the ones who did survive faced epidemics of sicknesses that wiped out tens of thousands of exhausted and starving refugees. During the genocide, World War I was taking place, which made it difficult for other countries to realize how the Armenian people were being treated. As time went on, countries did get involved, concerned for the Armenian people. Reports and eyewitness accounts from missionaries, diplomats, and journalists brought global awareness to the genocide, leading to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire ruling. The Armenian genocide ended in 1923. So Turkish denial. The Turkish government refuses to believe that what they did was a genocide. They believe that the death toll was around 200,000 to 300,000 people, when in reality it was 1.5 million deaths. The Turks claimed that the reason for the deaths of the Armenians were due to disease, famine, and ethnic conflict. Turkey, to this day, faces isolation on the world stage because of their refusal to refer to this tragedy as a genocide. It is illegal in Turkey to mention the Armenian genocide. The importance of remembering the Armenian genocide. It is important to bring awareness to the Armenian genocide to help educate people about the consequences of hatred, discrimination, and unchecked power. By learning about past genocides, societies can work towards preventing similar situations in the future. The international community must remain vigilant in protecting human rights. Recognition is a crucial step towards justice and healing. Acknowledging the genocide validates the Armenian victims' experiences and suffering. There needs to be a commitment to human rights and the principle that crimes against humanity should not be forgotten. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any more information on why it's illegal in Turkey to bring up the Armenian genocide.
So the government refuses to accept that they did that, and they don't want people. So I don't know fully, but I'm assuming that they're kind of embarrassed that this happened, and they don't want to bring attention to the fact that they're the ones to blame for the problem. So they kind of just don't want talk of it, I assume. Yeah.
Really great job, actually. Something that you brought up that piqued my interest or sort of reminded me of some things that are going on in modern times was the death marches and how they made them these intentionally tiresome, difficult, dangerous journeys, which ended up sort of in a roundabout way killing a lot of Armenians. And I just think that's an interesting concept in how you can, governments can create funnels in a way where it's we're not killing them here, we're not killing them here, we're punishing them here, but we're forcing them to do this thing, which will kill them.
Yeah.
So I guess I feel like the answer to the question, but the question is does the Turkish government take responsibility for the deaths that happened on the death marches, or no?
No, they kind of just don't really believe that they did anything in this, even though they did.
Yeah.
So it's really confusing because it's how do you say that you didn't do any of this, even though you're forcing Armenians to leave their homes, to do these death marches, sending them away from everything, and yeah. Oh, either.
My question is kind of getting at, they're trying to think about, the through line, if there is one, between this genocide and a number of the other genocides in the beginning And I know that in those genocides, there was a kind of shared logic of kind of social Darwinism, taking Charles Darwin's ideas about survival of the fittest and applying them to not natural systems, but to kind of political and social institutions to make claims about certain groups of people, typically ethnic groups or minorities, weakening or impurifying the nation. And obviously at this time period, right, Turkey was a new nation, right? The Ottoman Empire had just fallen, right? So that like impulse perhaps might have been big. I'm wondering if in your research you saw any evidence of this idea of like Armenians like weakening the moral fabric of the country, similarly to how, for example, Adolf Hitler used that same line in Germany.
Yeah, it really had a big thing to do with religion. So the Turks, they believed in Islam, and they did not believe in Christianity like Armenians did, and they were very separated by that, and they wanted the Armenians to believe in Islam, and they didn't, so that kind of caused divide because they were not believing the same thing.
That's an interesting difference. Yeah, thank you, Ashley.
Oh, okay.
Do you have any sense of how widely recognized the Armenian genocide is in the United States by the U.S. government and other the international community?
Yeah, I looked at many speeches that past presidents, U.S. presidents have admitted that, like, have talked about the Armenian genocide. I know Turkey still doesn't to this day, but I know that I think of who it was. I don't know on the top of my head, but I know that there are a few presidents that talked about the Armenian genocide.
So like, then like a few years ago, like Armenia went to war with like another country called like Azerbaijan, and they were like saying that it's like continuing the Armenian genocide. So like, there's like 1915 Armenian genocide. Like, is it like connected to like the like Armenian genocide in like 2020? Where they said like what was that country? Like they said that they were like killing Armenians.
I'm not sure. I haven't done research about like recent days of the Armenians. I'm sorry. Yeah, Parker?
Good job. How did sorry, that was real brief. But, like, when I see this, I also see what Mr. Brooks was talking about, who just left, about, like, how this connects to other things. Particularly, how does this connect to other indigenous movements, if you know at all? Because, for example, the Death March, I immediately went to the Trail of Tears and other things like that. And very similar things of, like, relocating and controlling a certain amount of land and saying, no, this is my land, falls in line with similar indigenous genocides. So, do you have any idea of that, or no?
I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
No, it's totally fine.
People were like passing immigrants like through Belfast and stuff like that, and they put up very strict uniform police there and first to like funnel them through this desert where they don't die. And like for anybody that takes care of it for us, you know what I mean? And it's just interesting, it's just like one way to like deny people, you know, because they're like, well, we It's
So
so
make sure
nature.
this here. And also that means we go down.
All right, we will get started on our final presentation today. Paul?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Wang, and today I'll be presenting about the influence of the China lobby in the U.S. during the 20th century. Now, for those who don't know what the China lobby is, it was a group of politicians, businessmen, and organizations that influenced the U.S. government to support nationalist China, which was then led by General Chiang Kai-shek. And like on the photo, like on here, like the woman on the right was the First Lady, and the one on the left was U.S. President Truman. Many people today don't know what the China lobby is, but the lobby played a significant and unique role in American history, as it received universal support across the political spectrums, and it influenced both America's domestic and foreign policies. Now, before explaining why the China lobby was influential, I think it's important to understand the origins of the relationship between the US and China. In the 1780s, the relationship between the two countries were only based on trade, as China was implementing isolationism, which meant that there were no diplomatic relations between the two countries. The U.S. experienced a huge deficit when trading with China. In the U.S., there were huge demands of Chinese goods, such as silk and porcelain, as they were considered rare and exotic. On the other hand, few in China demanded American goods. This meant that the U.S. was importing more than they were exporting to China. To balance the trade deficit, the U.S. began to export opium, a type of drug, to China. Due to the dangers of opium, the Chinese government, which was then under a monarchy, decided that it would withdraw opium. However, many Chinese people began to become addicted to opium, which made smuggling of opium to become a huge profitable business. And during the early 19th century, many American families built their fortunes from opium smuggling, including Warren Delano, whose grandson was FDR, the U.S. president during World War II. Now, for decades, the relationship between the U.S. and China were only limited through trade until 1844, the Treaty of Wanxia marked the official diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China. The treaty gave U.S. extraterritorial rights in China and allowed both countries to enjoy mutual trade. The most significant part of the agreement, which influenced the future China lobby, was allowing American Christian missionaries to operate in China, as the descendants of Christian missionaries in China became members of the future China lobby. After the treaty, relations between the U.S. and China were limited with few breakthroughs such as businesses and treaties. But in 1899, the Boxer Rebellion occurred. The Boxers' goal was to expel all foreigners and Christians from China. The rebellion was violent and was crushed by Western nations, including the U.S., which you can see up on the left, although there was an American flag on a Chinese building. Because the rebellion was violent and killed a lot of Western people in China, the Chinese government, who supported the Boxers initially, had to pay huge indemnities to the West after the rebellion. And unlike other countries who used the money to enrich themselves, the U.S. government established a scholarship fund in 1988 for Chinese students to study in the U.S., which you can see on the middle photo. That was a Congress resolution to establish the scholarship fund. And the purpose of establishing the scholarship fund was because during that time, China was experiencing a revolution, and the U.S. hoped to influence China's future by inviting future Chinese leaders to study in the U.S. and expose them to American values. And on the photo of the right, the person at the middle, he became the president of the Republic of China, like during the 1920s. And many of the people in these photos later became members of the future China lobby. In 1912, the Republic of China was established with the revolution succeeding, and the U.S. became the first foreign country to recognize the new government. Due to this, the relationship between the U.S. and the Republic of China were very friendly, with the political systems of the Republic of China being modeled after the U.S. As you can see from the left photo, the founding father of the Republic of China was inspired by Williston. Okay. So now let's talk about the China lobby. The China lobby played a significant role in the U.S. during the first half of the 20th century because it made the U.S. break out from its isolationist policies and join the Second World War, which transformed the U.S. into the global superpower which we know today. all internal fights and divisions were temporarily resolved due to the Japanese invasion of China. And this led to the China lobby to be established in the US because they needed American support. But because the US was experiencing isolationism, they weren't going to intervene for China. This meant that if China wanted to gain the government support, they had to win over the US public, which is what the China lobby did. So in 1937, which was when China and Japan went to the war, Time magazine declared Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of nationalist China, and his wife Song Mei-ming as Time's Person of the Year, as you can see from the second photo. Now, the founder of Time magazine was Henry Luce, who was the son of a Christian missionary in China, and he became a prominent member of the China lobby. Due to his Christian background, Luce supported Chiang Kai-shek as Chiang Kai-shek converted into Christianity in 1930. Meanwhile, Chiang's wife Song Mei-ming came from a prestigious family, with them being well-educated, good-looking, Christianized, and Americanized. Time magazine, under Luce, made sure to support the nationalists, with Chiang Kai-shek being portrayed as if he was the second Jesus Christ, and Song Mei-ming was portrayed as a feminist. And this immediately appealed to almost everyone in the US, because conservatives saw Chiang Kai-shek as the best hope for a Christianized China, while liberals saw Song Mei-ming as a feminist role model, as she had huge political influences, which was rare for like any woman back in the 1930s during the East and the West. Additionally, media outlets associated with the Luce also convinced the American public to support China, which you can see from the two posters at the right. What Luce forgot to mention was that China's internal divisions, such as the divisions between the communists and nationalists, or that the nationalist government was very corrupted. But at the end, they managed to win over the American public. There was also American businessmen who were members of the China lobby. Since the 19th century, many American businesses have been operating in China, and they've earned huge profits. With the Japanese invasion of China, many American businesses were negatively impacted by the war. One of the businessmen was Alfred Kober, who was an American textile importer that had huge business interests in China, and that's the photo of him on the left. Kober founded the organization the United China Relief, which donated a lot of money to China to help with the war relief. Joining Kober included many American businessmen who had business interests in China, which were all negatively impacted by the war. So the China lobby didn't just have the support of the American media and the public, but they also had financial and business sectors to support them, which attracted the attentions of American politicians. Political lobbying in the China lobby began officially in 1938. As seen in the photo of the right, there was a campaign for American Committee for the Non-Participation in Japanese Aggression, which composed of members of Congress and State Department who argued that it was in the U.S. interest to support China during World War II, not only because of business and humanitarian interests, but also geopolitics interests, as American troops were stationed in the Philippines and Guam, which is still part of the U.S. Then, in 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, with the U.S. officially entering the war. And the China lobby, and this was the China's lobby's goal, and then they became very successful as they got what they wanted. They had American support. And in 1943, the First Lady of China was invited to deliver the address to Congress, with her being the second woman and the first Chinese citizen to ever address Congress, with her calling for U.S. support for China. She was extremely successful and managed to win over the public and the U.S. government, as they've never seen a Chinese woman who could speak English so well. So she was an effective lobbyist. It wasn't just Song Mei-ming who was an effective lobbyist, but her older brother TV Song, as you can see from the top photo, with TV Song with Jesse Jones, who was the U.S. Secretary of Commerce in World War II, with Song leaving the meeting with Jones with $100 million US, which were brought the American government, given to him. But Song took the majority of the money and spent it on investments, which demonstrates how corrupted the government was. Then there was President FDR at the bottom right of the photo, and even though Roosevelt didn't really like nationalist in their lobbying. After World War II, the U.S. became one of the most powerful countries in the world, with the U.S. dollar becoming the global currency today. And this was mainly caused by the lobbying efforts of the China lobby, which made the U.S. decide to leave isolationism policy, demonstrates how powerful the China lobby was as they could influence America's foreign policies. But it wasn't just in World War II the China lobby played a prominent role. It was also during the Cold War, which with the China lobby helped engineer U.S. anti-communist policies and also helped them intervene during the Korean and Vietnam War. In 1949, the nationalist governments of China lost control of the Chinese mainland to the communists, with them retreating to Taiwan. This was a huge shock to many Americans, as since the beginning of the World War II, they all saw China as an ally, with many of them not even aware of the civil war in China or the nationalist corruption, as the China lobby denied and downplayed it, and so that the American public and politicians were not aware of the internal nationalists in China. But many of them only seen the nationalists as perfect democratic Christian figures. Although it was the nationalists who lost mainland China, many of them blamed it on the American government, including Senator Joseph McCarthy, who also was a member of the China lobby. And he famously said, "Who lost China?" McCarthy was convinced that there were Soviet collaborators in the U.S. State Department that allowed Mao and the Communist Party to take over mainland China. This was supported by members of the China lobby, which led to McCarthyism, which several Americans persecuted for being accused of being communists. The influence of the China lobby can also be demonstrated through them being successful to keep communist China away from the UN for nearly 2 decades. Prior to 1971, the Chinese seat in the UN was not held by the China we know today, but by the nationalist regime, which today is in Taiwan. The Committee of 1 Million Against the Mission of Communist China to the UN was established by members of the China lobby, where their goal is to prevent communist China from entering the UN and support the nationalist regime in Taiwan. To show that there was universal support across for the China lobby in American politics, on the open letter at the photo, which was a declaration by members of Congress to the U.S. of America, in the bottom half, these are the list of U.S. senators and House of Representatives of Congress from both the Republican and the Democratic Party that signed a letter to the UN, which proposed for China, and which was what they called China back then, and the United Nations. The loss of China to the Chinese Communist Party made the lobby extremely anti-communist, as American businessmen all had businesses in China, which they all lost it when the communists took over. And while for Chinese nationalists, it was considered very humiliating to lose your country. So the China lobby, motivated by anti-communism, convinced the U.S. to intervene during the Korean and Vietnam War, as they were all fighting against communists. One of the most influential members of the China lobby was Anna Chennault, who was the Chinese widow of World War II hero General Pierre Lee Chennault, with her being a supporter of the nationalists. And you can see her at the middle photo, with her standing between Nixon and Kissinger. Since Anna Chennault was a widow of a war hero, she was able to influence American foreign politics, with her constantly reminding the U.S. presidents and the public that the U.S. is responsible for the loss of China. This worked very well, as President LBJ, who was responsible for escalating U.S. intervention in Vietnam War, famously said that he doesn't want to be like the ones who lost China. And since back then, the Republican Party were more anti-communist, the China lobby supported the Republicans, such as Nixon, with them interfering in the election that helped Nixon win his presidential campaign. Despite the China lobby being extremely powerful from the 1930s to 1960s, as they were able to influence many of America's domestic and foreign policies, its power soon began to decline during the 1970s. In 1971, nationalist China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was expelled from the United Nations, and this meant that the People's Republic of China, the China was able to enter into the UN. Then in 1972, Nixon visited China, and finally in 1979, the U.S. established a diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China under Jimmy Carter, which demonstrated that the China lobby declined. Although the China lobby is no longer as prominent as before, it was without doubt very powerful and influential in the domestic and foreign policies in the U.S. Thank you.
First of all, I thought that was a fantastic and comprehensive overview of relations between, nationalist China and the U.S. My question is, do you have any knowledge of or know of, is there an iteration of this relationship that does exist today? Like, I know, obviously, in the end there you said the U.S. has for some time now acknowledged, or has relations with the People's Republic of China, but is there some sort of, U.S. relations with Taiwan now, or something like that? Like, is there an iteration of this that exists now?
Yeah, there still is, but the China lobby is like right now it's not really connected to either Taiwan or the people
Okay.
of China.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there anything that surprised you in your research, just in terms of when you started doing this? Was there anything that you weren't aware of that you were surprised?
I wasn't aware of how powerful they were, how they were able to influence policies. I was aware that this China lobby existed, but I wasn't aware how they were very powerful and influenced both domestic and U.S. foreign policy during the 20th century. Yeah.
This isn't a question, it's actually more of a comment that I was kind of noticing. I've read this history so much in so many different books and textbooks and stuff, and nobody has ever really emphasized the kind of role that the Chinese lobby was kind of playing behind the scenes. And I just wanted to say that, right, that you kind of identified something, a major sort of, you convinced me, right, that there's a kind of force going through all of these major moments that, frankly, a lot of textbooks that I've read haven't really talked about. It's not a question, I just want to say kind of kudos to you for unearthing that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've never really helpful again. It's just, I never thought about it before.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the photos also, that you cited everything properly. Well done, advisee. I am wondering how, so you just acknowledged too that you did know of the China lobby, but how did you come to this decision to choose this as your Williston Scholar Program, and what played into the decision to kind of hone in on this particular part of China's history?
I read about it last year in AP Gov class. It was in a note-taking class. We were looking at primary documents, and then that was something I saw in the primary documents. So and that got me interested because I've never heard of this before. I'm Chinese, I studied in the U.S., but I've never heard of it before. So that's what made me interested in this topic. Yeah. Okay.
So there, when I went to the Nixon's presidential library, a big accomplishment of his is opening up China, and I didn't know about how comprehensive our relationships were before then, when when China turned communist and closed off the United States. So what do you think about that narrative that Nixon opened up China?
It does make sense, because the China today was very different from the China in the past. There was a period of isolationism when the communists was over. So it does make sense that Nixon opened up China. But there was also before there was war. Because today's China was the one that Nixon technically opened up, but the ones before that was still existed. Yeah.
I'm curious in your research if you came across any connections between sort of the opium epidemic that was happening in China and the opioid crisis that's happening in the U.S. right now, and whether there are any commentary about the sort of malice and intent that was ascribed to the opium epidemic versus what seems more like negligence now, or if you think the narrative will sort of evolve.
I have no idea.